Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us to today's session. I'm excited that we have an intimate group here today, which allows us to really get into the content. My name is Keith Mokris, VP of Marketing at Orca Security, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Sri Tiruvidhula, Principal Engineer at Autodesk, and Gus Evangelakos, VP of Solution Engineering at Orca Security. And after I set the stage in a couple of minutes, we're going to dig into ultimately, how a company like Autodesk is approaching global risk management, security, and other important themes in the cloud here on AWS. So very excited to ultimately bring Sri up here in a couple of minutes to unpack what that looks like, and then talk about how Autodesk and Orca Security are partnering to manage risks and prioritize issues at scale. So one of the things I wanted to do to set the stage is Orca recently published its 2025 State of Cloud Security report. We had a separate session on that roughly 90 minutes ago. And I wanted to kind of peel back some of the layers as we looked at over 1 billion different cloud assets across the 5 biggest cloud providers around the world. And one of the things that I pulled is that vulnerability management is still a huge problem in the cloud. And that's something that we'll definitely talk about today. And one of the important statistics that was in that report was that the average asset has 115 different vulnerabilities on it. So as you can imagine, finding out which vulnerabilities are most impactful, most important, and where you're going to work with your development and DevOps teams to rebuild and redeploy applications is a gigantic challenge. Not only on the prioritization side, but on the friction and efficiency side to make sure teams are spending time, ultimately making their environments more secure. Another big area of the report that we looked at was what we call neglected assets. And ultimately, neglected assets are assets that haven't been touched over a significant period of time. These are assets that might have a very outdated host operating system, for example. And we found that 1/3 of all cloud assets are neglected. And this can lead to things like plain text secrets being embedded within code repositories. So source code repositories can be a huge gateway, for attackers if they're not monitored and looked at securely. And then as we think about neglected assets and how they can be interconnected to other risks, one of the things I highlighted was 76% of organizations have a cloud asset that's public-facing and could enable lateral movement around their environment. And so if you're an attacker, this would be something that would certainly be a target for you to not only connect to that asset and see what might be available there, but to see what else you might be able to jump to and connect to. And when we work with prospects and customers at Orca Security, we find that they have a wide variety of unique challenges. And it's great when we can talk about our view of the world paired with a real world customer like Sri and his team and what they're trying to look at and solve day in and day out. I think one of the things that can be a big challenge that people underestimate is we're at a conference here, AWS Reinforce, obviously focused on security. But I think about all the AWS conferences I've gone to going back 7 or 8 years, and all the new, not only security tools AWS is releasing, which is awesome, but all the different infrastructure services. I remember being at the conference where managed Kubernetes felt like the next big wave of opportunity for organizations. And then things like Fargate and AWS Lambda came about. And security teams are really challenged to understand these new technology stacks, not only in how they work, but what's the risk posture of these services. How do I work with the development teams or DevOps teams that are utilizing these services? As you think about the world we're in with Gen AI, development and DevOps teams are flocking to Gen AI for a lot of different reasons when it comes to their coding practices. This can obviously present a huge challenge for security teams, and I know we'll plug into that a little bit today. I think compliance requirements are obviously important, whether it's an external regime or an internal process that you're trying to meet. And I hope that some of these other challenges that we see resonate with you in your kind of view of the world as well. And I think this ultimately brings us to what are the different needs of developers and their security counterparts. And so there's different needs when you think about how do you secure your applications as they're being designed, built, and deployed. And then how do you at runtime or in production think about monitoring this very big attack surface? And ultimately, I would think of this kind of bar or connection point underneath where it's like, how do I trace things from right to left? So if I have a risk in a production environment, how do I go and find the developer or DevOps team responsible for that application, responsible for that infrastructure, and ultimately ensure it's more and more secure? And again, this can be a huge challenge from a team efficiency point of view. One of the things that, there's 2 more slides I have before I hand the mic over to Shri. And I think it's important to think about cloud native architectures, because I think the world some people live in is we kind of assume we deeply know all the different needs of these architectures. And I would certainly not come here to AWS Reinforce and lecture anyone on the needs for securing modern virtualized servers like EC2 in the cloud. I think everyone would have a really good understanding here of virtualization. But when you think about containers, Kubernetes, serverless applications, or PaaS, depending on how you like to term it, you start to get into more and more lightweight applications that are deployed at a higher and higher velocity in a more and more event-driven way. And this means that understanding these architectures and how it fits into your organization's overall risk posture is really, really important. And there's ultimately different considerations that you might want to take based on the different risk posture or threat levels or how you think about your organization using these applications. I've certainly come to understand that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for any organization. In today's world, almost everyone is using a combination of these architectures in some capacity. I'll go back. There's someone trying to take a picture there, so we can totally pause it. It's no big deal. And ultimately, again, this kind of feeds into the last slide, for example. When you think about all the services that have been released, this is just one of the layers, the application or workload layer, that AWS is obviously working to be a leader in releasing these to customers. And then this is, I think, being at AWS, a really good way to think about the different areas of getting cloud security right. I think it can be really easy to just make cloud security a foundational data security problem. You don't want PII, corporate information, personal information of customers leaked into the outside world. So how do you make sure you understand where your crown jewels are, what might be accessing them, and if they're ultimately secure? Then you have to think about your infrastructure layer. So how have I configured all of the different services that I'm using on AWS? What applications are then going to run on top of that infrastructure? And then one of the, I think, biggest challenges can be identities and entitlements. Entitlements might be the roles, service accounts, or permissions that I may get access to if I'm running in the cloud. And then certainly, as we highlighted a little bit ago, getting into the pipeline and thinking about how do I secure my applications or infrastructure as code templates that I'm going to provision earlier and earlier in the application lifecycle rather than being reactive in production. This ultimately brings me to introduce Shri Tirivithula, hand the mic over to him as he drives through the real world use case at Autodesk, and Gus will be joining him.
Thank you.
Great job, Keith.
Okay. Thank you, Keith. So before I start, I just want to share that all the statements and opinions that I'm going to share are my personal opinions and do not represent the views of Autodesk. So with that said, I'll quickly explain what Autodesk does. So Autodesk is a global leader platform, SaaS platform for design and make industry. So we have products and software for entertainment industry, for design and manufacturing. We also have products in architecture and construction. So anything and everything that people can think of in terms of design and make, Autodesk has a solution for it. So we have a wide range of products, majority of them deployed on AWS, and as I'm from a security background, we wanted to secure most of our solutions. So we work with developers, product managers to drive down risk in terms of vulnerabilities, in terms of misconfigurations at scale. So that's what we are going to be talking today. And with that said, a quick high-level background on the architecture of Autodesk. We are multi-cloud, as previously mentioned, with a heavy adoption in AWS, and a commonly used or highly adopted AWS services include EC2s, ECS, Lambdas, S3, and also DynamoDBs, so things like that. So anything which is very high in the industry in terms of adoption, Autodesk has a presence in terms of its usage. Coming down to the security use cases that Autodesk had in terms of cloud was we wanted to identify telemetry, visibility in all the subscriptions that get spun up and all the assets that get created and configured in the respective cloud subscriptions. And we also wanted to identify the misconfigurations in the cloud. So once we get the telemetry, we also want to look how the specific service is configured, how the specific asset is configured in the cloud, so that does it create any lateral movement, does it create any attack path, and all those type of asset context as well. We also have a golden image program where we build out secure hardened images, both for AMIs and container images, where we check for CIS benchmarks and also make sure that the image is free of any CVEs, so that is free of vulnerabilities. So the downstream product teams can consume them and build in their pipelines for their respective services. And another core security use case is the vulnerability management program at Autodesk. We want to scan all our cloud assets, make sure that they are free of vulnerabilities. So we wanted to have a solution which can scale. So we use Orca's agentless platform to onboard all our cloud assets and cloud subscriptions, so that we'll be able to get all vulnerabilities and share that across teams so that they can drive down vulnerabilities and cloud misconfigurations. And with that, there was the final use case of risk prioritization. So once we operate at scale, there comes a huge number of alerts, vulnerabilities. So how do we ask teams to prioritize? So Autodesk partnered with Orca in terms of a risk prioritization framework, where we look into the vulnerability context, where we look into the asset context, something like if it is present in CISA if it is actively exploited, a CVE, and also look into the asset if it is in production, is it like internet facing, so things like that. We weigh in, we come up with a logic to score a specific vulnerability so that we provide guidance for product teams. So that's been very useful for our product teams. They have seen correct guidance and appropriate direction in terms of reducing vulnerabilities and misconfigurations in the cloud. So the key challenges that we face were like alert fatigue, as previously mentioned. Without proper context, there were too many of alerts in terms of vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. So we needed a solution which helps us prioritize in terms of being valuable to developers' time, and also making sure that we pinpoint the critical risk for our developers to drive down risk. And we also wanted a solution which could scale and at the same time be very less in terms of false positives. So that agentless scanning from Orca has been really helpful in making sure that we will be able to scale in terms of any new subscriptions, and also working with exception management has been very helpful in terms of driving down false positives or any acceptance risk. And prioritization is one more key factor that we wanted in terms of priority for vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. So when we bubble up all of these findings, there are too many for developers to handle at once. So developers have very limited time in their sprint cycle, so they can't focus on all alerts that get identified in tools. So we work with developers in making sure that they label their asset in terms of production, dev stage, and also making sure that if it is a crown jewel, they mark it, so that we calculate all of that into our prioritization logic. And lack of context is when an alert doesn't look into the 360 degree of its deployment in the cloud. So does it create any lateral movement alert, or does it create any attack path issue, so that we need to make sure that we bubble up these findings so that teams drive down the critical risk as soon as possible. And we needed a solution which is multi-cloud, so that we'll be able to scan using one solution instead of many. And with that said, Autodesk was able to mature the vulnerability management program in the cloud using Orca, mainly with the help of agentless scanning. So we will be able to scan all new subscriptions, new assets in the cloud as they get created. And granular exception feature is very helpful, where we can point out a specific CVE, specific asset, specific file path, and we can also drill down and also make sure that how many days do you want the exception to be lasting for. And as previously mentioned, prioritization is really helpful for developer teams in terms of prioritizing their remediation. And shift left security will tie with our golden image program, where we check for all the CIS benchmarks for AMIs, and at the same time for our container images. And these hardened images are also free of vulnerabilities. So if there is a fix available, we make sure that the fix is applied before we share to the corresponding product teams for downstream applications. And for cloud misconfigurations, we look into the entire 360-degree view of the cloud, making sure that there are no lateral movement alerts, storage misconfigurations. It could also be identity misconfigurations, network misconfigurations, where we want to highlight those for the respective product teams to work. And risk prioritization, the context of the asset and also the alert is really beneficial in terms of highlighting which one needs to be prioritized and remediated as soon as possible, given the respective SLAs. So here is an example from Orca demo account, where you can see the attack path or the entire TTP, if you can look at here, where there is a public facing EC2 instance which has malware, could also have more vulnerabilities or issues. So it's kind of a critical risk processing asset, and it is tied to it has an SSH insecure key on its disk, which could allow an attacker, if exploited, to laterally move to a dev EC2 instance, and that dev EC2 instance has access to a corresponding data, which is potentially could be a customer's, could be something sensitive which is at risk. So this entire flow of action could be very risky if an attacker from the internet exploits the first EC2 instance, which is public facing. So these kind of risk is something that is really valuable, where we can pinpoint what is the immediate action a developer or an engineer needs to be doing. So either they fix the malware alert, or they make sure that they remediate the insecure SSH key to drive down the lateral movement risk here. So things like this are really helpful for security engineers to get the 360-degree context, and also look at what is important for the service. With that said, I'll pass it on to Keith for the upcoming features and also a few features that are already in production from Orca.
Thank you, Sri, and thank you everyone for having us here. So as far as Orca's vision for customers like Autodesk, one of our key things is continuously helping prioritize and just making teams more effective. The ways we've done that has been through attack paths, through dynamic risk scores, as Sri mentioned, and just continuously adding more and more context to help customers make quicker decisions and with less false positives. So one of the new capabilities that we launched about a month ago is agentless reachability analysis. A lot of our customers have and love the agentless vulnerability scanning. We're reporting vulnerabilities on containers, on images, but sometimes you send an alert or an issue to a developer, and you usually get possibly a response back saying, hey, this is part of the build file, but when that thing runs, it's not going to be in the container, right? So one of the things that our CTO team set out to do is understand how can we do this agentlessly, because there are ways to do that with sensors and looking at memory, but let's be realistic here, right? You can't always deploy thousands of sensors on every system. So we did set out a way to find how we can do this statically, how do we do it agentlessly. And one of the things that we were able to identify is starting points, entry points for containers, and what actually will launch once that container runs. And the reachability analysis helps reduce vulnerabilities on containers that you would report, just like any other prioritization on vulnerabilities. So many customers use criticalities, fix available, other components to prioritize, but this piece to say, will this package be loaded when it runs? And if you can answer yes or no to that, when you're sending these issues to your developers, you are less likely to get a response back of, this is not going to be a problem, right? And that is one of the key focuses of the reachability analysis that we launched agentlessly, and that has really helped reduce vulnerabilities by as much as like 50 to 60% on containers that are being reported by simply just saying, is it reachable, yes or no? Sri, I would love your comments to see how would this help you guys at Autodesk and any other customer?
This would be great, because the best thing about this is can be achieved without a sensor. So driving teams to install a sensor would take time and also not scalable. But doing this agentlessly is very good. And given that this can drive down risk in terms of pinpointing which can be reachable, will help product teams focus on the very important stuff in their sprints. So they have very limited time in their sprint dev cycle. So just focusing on things that are really critical would be something that would be helpful for security teams, and at the same time for product.
Fantastic. Yeah, and the other part to this is Sri mentioned before, tying this into GitHub scanning, right? And being able to actually, one of Orca's key components here is when you do tie your GitHub repos or Bitbuckets, we're actually able to correlate deployed assets back to those repositories through different Docker files or Terraform files. And being able to just see the full cycle of being able to click on a container or an alert in production, seeing which repository it's coming from, what's in that code, what risks are there, and ultimately being able to tie the pieces together and say, yes, this package belongs here, it came from this Docker file. It'd be best if we can just prevent it from being pushed out vulnerability. It also allows a conversation from security to DevOps, because you can show the evidence, right? You can actually say, here's what is going to actually run. And yeah, this has been a great addition. I can remember Shri's reaction when we said it was agentless, so that was great. One of the other key components here is AI SPM, right? Gen AI and everyone using different AI services. As we spoke to many customers over the last few months or year or so, one of the key factors is not even knowing what AI is actually deployed, what services, whether it be Bedrock or OpenAI, just understanding the inventory part to know, is anyone in my organization using AI services? And furthermore, part of this is not just so much about the cloud services, which you can typically get via APIs, and there's many capabilities to understand the inventory. But one of the bigger risks is also on the actual workloads themselves. When you're installing LangChain or all these other libraries that are related to that, many customers don't understand that there's vulnerabilities just like any other package, right? And so the full component here is not just necessarily understanding the inventory or the configurations of the cloud service itself, but also how many VMs are out there that have AI applications loaded that might have sensitive data that are being trained on, and also are any of these packages vulnerable that might allow an attacker to compromise a data model or a VM, for example. So that is something that Orca is very, very well full-on roadmap. We also have obviously existing things. We also use AI ourselves in a lot of different parts of the product. But you know, I would love to hear your thoughts on the AI components and how we've helped from that aspect.
Yeah, AI SPM would really help in terms of, let's step back and analyze what organizations want in terms of security. To start with, everybody wants to know what packages and libraries are deployed at scale, because we have so many developers who use the new stuff which gets available every day. So it gives amazing opportunities for companies to build, and also at the same time gives tremendous challenges for security teams to catch up. So the first use case for everybody is telemetry, visibility into GenAI applications, and also libraries and packages. So getting that would be itself be a huge benefit. And on top of that, getting vulnerabilities and alerts and risks for AI-related packages and libraries would really help, given that there are so many incidents that are happening out in the industry around AI. It's better that we have the right visibility so that we can drive down risk for everybody. So it will be a huge benefit in terms of AI SPM.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been very helpful for many. I mean, the most important conversation for most customers that we get asked is, do I have any of these services in my environment? Especially when customers have 500, 1,000 accounts across multi-cloud, it's usually a challenge to understand what's even enabled. Which leads to the next topic, which is also data security posture management, right? Obviously, there's a lot of talk about this. Part of that relates to the previous slide, which is AI SPM. A lot of the workloads have sensitive data, right? There's training data that live on these workloads. And the easy part of this, of doing DSPM, is analyzing the services themselves, right? A database is supposed to have data. Okay, what kind of data does it have? Is it publicly exposed? Buckets, et cetera. A harder part too is also on the workloads. A lot of customers that we typically work on with data security posture management don't realize how many secrets, keys, dumps of exports of databases might actually live on their VMs, and how they're exposed, and how all those components actually add to the risk scoring. So when Sri earlier was talking about risk prioritization, part of Orca's goal here is to really raise the risk to the business, not just the risk for a vulnerability. And the part of the dynamic risk scoring that Orca does, especially with data security posture management, is when we do generate an alert, for example, for a VM with a vulnerability, part of the other context that's added in there is, did we find sensitive data on the system? Because that could determine if it's a critical or a high, right? I might need to fix the vulnerability based on some factors, but if it also has sensitive information that could possibly cause a data breach or anything like that, I would want to escalate that even higher. And this is part of the whole dynamic process of Orca, and constantly looking at changes in the environment to help increase scores and severities. And as far as data security posture management itself goes, we have customers even recently where use cases come up all the time. We had a customer in India where they asked us, hey, we really need OCR scanning in the cloud, because we have an application. We are asked to upload customer driver's licenses to the cloud. We store it somewhere. We have no solution for it. So we were able to do everything else. So we work with customers, with partners like Autodesk, and we actually create an OCR scanning where now we can scan image files for this type of data. And these are kind of the use cases that keep coming up based on what customers are building. So we're constantly evolving in what we are actually scanning for data. But part of this is the configurations, understanding I have a bucket that's public. You might not care because you have another 30, but also understanding, is there anything important on that can help, say, just a misconfiguration check gets elevated to a critical because it's a public bucket and it has credit card information or something along those lines. Any comments from you, Sri?
Yeah, the ability to scan different asset types like storage buckets, Azure blobs, or maybe even expanding into past databases. And again, going back to the fundamentals of VMs and containers, if they have any storage attached to them, like a block storage, elastic block storage. If we want to scan and identify issues, that would be really helpful. And also Orca provides the ability to customize your scanning logics. Like sometimes the sensitive is a relative term, right? Like something that is sensitive to a medical industry might not be something sensitive to a different customer in a different industry. So the ability to fine-tune your scanning logic and rules is very beneficial. And to tie all this together, it also bubbles up using the risk prioritization you mentioned. So we also want to be respectful of developers' time. So we want to only highlight the things that we want teams to really prioritize. So the previous example of an attack path that I showed on one of the earlier slide, which had an insecure SSH key on a EC2 instance, would again tie back to the DSPM module, because it has an insecure SSH key which is sensitive, shouldn't be there. Using Orca's risk prioritization, it would bubble up so that teams can focus on things like that. So DSPM, again tying back to AISPM, would be really beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, data security is obviously one of the biggest concerns. Having worked in on-prem world around data security, who's accessing what, it's obviously, where everyone's putting data, storing data, customer data, whatever it might be. So understanding its exposure, where it lives, who has access to it is obviously a key capability and prioritization. And it is all native within Orca scanning capabilities. Our next subject here is KSPM and how do we manage native applications. So Kubernetes obviously is very prevalent in the cloud in many different flavors. EKS is definitely very popular, but there also are risks here, right? There's risks from the endpoint itself being public, there's service accounts, there's vulnerabilities that are part of the containers. So KSPM really helps be proactive in how you manage, I guess, your deployments within clusters and what applications are running with them, understanding the namespaces, the pods, and actually what everything relates to each other. How do we identify, for example, one image is being used for multiple clusters that are running thousands of containers, and all we really need to do is really patch that one image that everyone is pulling from. And this is the kind of context that Orca can help with Kubernetes and containers, and being able to, even from a compliance perspective, give you best practices, helping you understand lateral movements when there's service accounts linked to IAM roles within Kubernetes, and how you can elevate privileges, both from the cloud to the cluster and from the cluster back to AWS, right? So those are all the types of context and correlation that we're doing. And in some cases, we also do have sensor deployments where customers will actually want to monitor real-time threats with Orca and do deploy on their Kubernetes clusters to like privilege escapes or escalations from the containers themselves. So KSPM for us is very big. Obviously, many customers use it, including running on just, what do you call, I'm sorry, not managed services, but just self-service like OpenShift and stuff like that. So, yeah.
So the added benefit that I would like to add is Orca has the ability to onboard public clusters automatically. So with the agentless scanning, Orca is able to onboard any public clusters. And for private clusters, that's where the sensor that you mentioned, which is done through a connector.
Yes.
And the ease of use is through Helm chart, so it should be easy for your DevOps teams to onboard Orca connector as part of their build pipeline. So once we have the connector, I think we'll be able to look into all the risks and misconfiguration on the control plane data. So that would include any network misconfigurations, identity, or on the admission controller, anything that we want to prioritize, coupled with the data security scanning that Orca offers.
Yeah, that's a good point. The one good thing that many customers see is that because we are completely agentless, and a lot of the containers that are running on nodes are basically EC2 instances, right? So there is no actual requirement to onboard any of your cluster K8's API to actually scan your containers. So one of the biggest things that customers get when they do connect Orca is actually get visibility into a lot of containers that are running that they have no idea because sensors have never been deployed to those clusters, and they get that visibility instantly without ever connecting to a Kubernetes API endpoint, because all the underlying infrastructure is EC2 for the nodes, and we're automatically scanning those, without agents using snapshots. All right, and just to close this up, we at Orca, have been around for 5 years. We are deeply integrated with AWS. We run on AWS, and we have many services and extra checks. Like, we have customers of all sizes, and a lot of the requirements can range, right? Some of our largest customers have asked us, just because they want to build their own compliance checks, to model additional information or additional checks that they need for their own compliance checks and what they want to meet. But the big point here is, from a scaling perspective, from just inventory and risk, one of our biggest integrations with AWS is all the different services that they have, and being able to model, allow you to build queries, export whatever you want, and obviously provide risk and reporting and things like that. And thank you all for your time.